Hello and welcome to the Mythic Mind Fellowship podcast, which is a platform for giving a voice to our patrons. My name is Andrew Snyder, and I'm the founder of this fellowship and the host of the Mythic Mind Legacy podcast, and I heartily welcome you around our hearth. This is the second episode in our patron-led series on the Poetic Edda, which is one of our primary sources for information on Norse myths and legends. This is a lot of fun, and I would love for you to join us in these chats if you're interested in doing so. Just head over to patreon.com/mythicmind and sign up with any level of support. And of course, you can lend your support even if you don't want to join these conversations, but you do want to see us have the ability to do more things like this on a regular basis. And if you're listening to this as a podcast, know that you can also catch the video on my YouTube channel, which you'll find a link to in the show notes. And if you're watching this on YouTube, know that you can also catch it on the podcast. Well, now let's go ahead and jump into the conversation. All right, well, welcome back to the latest Mythic Mind Fellowship chat as we continue through the Poetic Edda. This is our second episode on that, going through the next four sections of the Edda, starting with Vafthrudnir's sayings, which is just saying that I'm probably butchering the Norse, but it still sounds really cool, especially if you just say it confidently with some guttural intensity behind it. So I'm joined today by Thomas, who was with us last time, and he's obviously made a number of appearances by this point. And then Chase, who's been on the other show. We were talking about the ransom stuff, but first time on the Fellowship podcast. So, Chase, why don't you tell us who you are?
Yeah, Chase, I'm in Texas, and just found out about Andrew's classes, and so I did the Lewis class, and I just finished up the Boethius and Beowulf class, and just can't get enough of it. So, really enjoying just giving myself a classical education in some ways.
Fantastic. And, you definitely have the beard for this conversation. I feel a little envious as we're talking about, Vikings and the Norse mythos. Well, just like last time, I'm going to start off with each of these sections that we're reading. I'm just going to read at least a portion of the intro that's provided in the Larrington translation of the Poetic Edda. Since I know that there are probably a number of people listening who haven't read along. And by the way, I should say that we're all amateurs at this, kind of reading along ourselves for the first time. And so, we all have some interest in myths and legends, and obviously the material that's been inspired by these legends, people like Tolkien, people like Lewis. And so it's a lot of fun to get beneath the surface and read the kinds of things these people are reading. But I should emphasize that we are all just amateurs in these waters. But I think that's kind of fun as well. But yeah, so I'm just going to read a portion of the intro so that way we all have an idea as to what it is that we're talking about, and then we'll just kind of jump in around to whatever we feel like discussing. All right. As the Seer's prophecy, sayings of the High One, and Grimnir's sayings show, Odin is characterized by his obsessive quest for wisdom, particularly for information about Ragnarok. In this poem, he sets off, against his wife's advice, disguised as a poor wanderer, to test his wisdom against the giant Vafthrudnir, known only from this poem. Once Odin has proved his mettle by answering questions which the giant puts to him, he is invited to risk his head in questioning the giant. Vafthrudnir's sayings, or Vafthrudismal, belongs to the genre of wisdom contest known in many other cultures. And so this really comes down to a riddle contest. It's a contest of lore, which, I mean, these contests should sound very familiar to us from, some of the literature that's been inspired from these stories. I think of, obviously, Tolkien, you got your Riddles in the Dark with the contest
Yes,
between,
that was what I
Gollum and
first thought of when the little prose section before was explaining that. I'm like, it's Riddles in the Dark.
exactly. And then even, I mean, spoiler, I guess, at the end, when Odin asked a question that only he could know, I mean, that's Bilbo, right?
Uh-huh.
What's in my pocket? It's like, no one else can know that. And so I have to believe that Tolkien's pulling something from that. And then also, I think of in That Hideous Strength, when Merlin and Ransom start sparring with lore, going back and forth about, just different aspects of the cosmos and, the mythos. And I've definitely see that pulled from this genre as well. But yeah, so I mean, what'd you think of this? I mean, what are some things that stood out to you, or what were your first impressions?
I felt like a lot of the questions, though, didn't seem like riddles to me. They just seemed more like trivia questions. Like, can you answer this fact about the cosmos or about history or about the future? I'm like, is that really a riddle? It's more like a
Yeah,
question.
yeah, it definitely did seem more like a Jeopardy mythology
Yeah.
edition. Yeah, and so I agree that that's why I feel like it has more resonance, with specifically in that hideous strength, that Ransom Merlin lore battle when they are just spouting off different aspects of lore. But I do think that ending is very Riddles in the Dark to me. um, I don't know. What do you think going into this chase?
Yeah, I mean, interesting kind of have like the thread of like, if you're not wise, like you're not leaving the hall. And uh, just kind of like battling a little bit with, I couldn't tell if he was like offering hospitality a bit of like, come sit with me. And then he's like, I'm not going to be tricked by something like that. I'm going to stay where I'm at right now. I'm okay with that. But,
Yeah,
uh,
the hospitality definitely seems to be an invitation to a challenge. It's not
yeah,
genuine hospitality per se.
right.
Um, And I do find it kind of interesting that Vafthrudnir, that the giant, is he's tends to be mostly focused on asking questions about just general trivia about the world as it is, whereas Odin has a much more chronological interest, and that he has questions like from origins going all the way up to Ragnarok. And
Hmm.
this, I think, gets to a theme that we see with Odin again and again. He's trying to get some understanding regarding the fate of the gods. He wants to know what's going to happen to him, I guess, out of some hope to evade fate, maybe, or at the very least to know what awaits him. And so he definitely has an interest regarding the timeline, I think, more so than we get with the giant, which I think is kind of interesting. Um,
I just thought it was interesting how kind of like visualizing the scene and how Odin had shown himself as basically a man. So I'm assuming he's small compared to this giant. Then he's also, giant's up sitting and he's talking about like you from the floor. So I could just imagine like how imposing that would be, like talking back and forth, right? He's seeing Odin so small that he's like, you're there from the hall floor, not from up by me.
Yeah, and I think that's part of Odin's tendency to mask his identity. I mean, the fact that he is masking his identity, right? He's using a pseudonym here. It's
Mhm.
not the giant doesn't figure this out until the very end. And Odin does this all the time. Whenever Odin makes an appearance, he's almost always using a false name. He's in disguise. He's veiled in some way, shape, or form. And I can only assume that's because, Odin's associated with wisdom. And so, speaks to the fact that wisdom requires the right kind of eyes to see, that you have to be wise in order to see wisdom, right? The beginning of wisdom is this, get wisdom, the Proverbs tell us.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of paradoxical, but it's like you need wisdom to reveal wisdom. And even Odin himself, he has one eye because he had to sacrifice part of his vision in order to get wisdom. And so it's like you have to learn to see with the right eyes. And so, wisdom is veiled and it's dealing with mortals, and we need the right kind of wisdom to uncover it.
I've noticed that Merlin in the Arthur material does this a lot too, where he'll veil himself in some other form, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. Mostly familiar with Mallory for the Arthur mythos. He does it for like no reason a lot of times that I can tell.
Yeah, that's
He's
very
just constantly
true.
veiling himself and appearing in different guises for, again, no clear reason sometimes. Which, it kind of makes sense that you know, Gandalf is kind of inspired by Odin, as well as surely, Merlin is wrapped up in that. And so
Oh
it's
yeah.
interesting that there are these crossover tendencies between Merlin and Odin. And I can only wonder if maybe, the early stories of Merlin have some connection to the early stories of Odin.
Of Odin, yeah. And I know that Gandalf also includes like I read somewhere that he includes a little bit of Odin
Hmm.
as well, especially as like just this wanderer. like a higher being disguised as an old beggar just wandering around and seeking wisdom, you know.
Yeah, yeah. If you look at some of the depictions of Odin, I mean, very much get the Great Pilgrim imagery.
I had wondered too, I don't know enough like historically, so I know like Romans had made it to Britain much earlier than this and had at least brought some Christianity. I don't know how much like had stayed there throughout once they had left, or if it had kind of like completely gone back to pagan roots for the most part. Just trying to see like, okay, like this was like composed like around 1,000, right? AD, or was this earlier? Or they just don't know.
I mean, I don't, I'm not really sure. I know the prose Edda is like somewhere around 1,000 or so with Snorri Sturluson, which that comes a little bit later than the Poetic Edda. I'm actually can't recall offhand when this was put together, but I assume more or less the same time,
And I know that
roughly.
that the British Isles essentially had to be almost re-evangelized at one point, where Augustine of Canterbury is literally sent by the Pope to say, okay, like the Roman authority has collapsed, people are lapsing back into pagan beliefs. There's the Viking invasions of the British Isles. Like, okay, go take some monks, go to Britain and re-evangelize the place.
Yeah. Because I wondered just from like saying of like the sayings of what was it, the sayings of the High One that I just read before it, and then even like wisdom in this, like how much of it was like, okay, maybe there were some proverbs left over or something like they had heard a little bit of that and that knowledge kind of kept, but then morphed. I don't know. But I do think it is funny that, Odin says like it's good to be averagely wise, but then he's on this quest to like prove that he's the most wise. And you're like, you're not taking your own
Advice.
advice. Yeah.
Yeah, it is interesting. Just kind of wondering exactly what Odin is doing here. Is he simply trying to best the giant, or is he trying to get some wisdom from the giant that he doesn't know? And I guess it kind of seems like he's trying to get some more knowledge of Ragnarok. It's my understanding of it. Um, which,
Yeah, I think that's what they were saying
yeah,
too, where like he kind of shuts it down pretty quickly after finding out something that he doesn't like to hear. So
right. He got what he wanted to know. Um, and you know, I I'm kind of spitballing it here when I talk about like what different things mean because I'm not an expert on the northern mythology or philosophy, but I know that the giants are more primordial than even the gods, and so it kind of seems like giants almost have a sense of timelessness about them, and that it's the gods who use this kind of primordial giant what was this Ymir, right, which they use Ymir to construct the world, and then they created man within the cosmos created by the body of this giant. It's just like the gods themselves are more essentially related to time, the movement of events, the creation of the material world. And so I assume that has something to feed into Odin's obsession with sort of the end of things, the end of his life, the end of the reign of these gods. That there's almost a more intrinsically temporal element to the gods than the giants.
I was struck by the creation of the world from Ymir's body because that confused me because I'm like, wait a minute. I thought the world is the world tree in Norse mythology. So I'm wondering like how they reconciled those like if they were originally two kind of threads of cosmology that somehow got reconciled, or maybe like Ymir's body is only Midgard and that doesn't have to do with the rest of the realms on the world tree. Like I'm not sure their cosmology is entirely coherent, but
I think that's fair, especially when we're dealing with the Poetic Edda, which is earlier, it's more discordant. I mean, not all the myths agree with each other.
Mhm.
We're dealing with a number of different traditions sort of thrown together. Um, it's not like they have a universal canon to work with.
mhm.
Um, yeah, so I don't know. Maybe it's just Midgard. That might be. Although I'm pretty sure at some point, maybe it was one of the other readings from this round, that they talk about like Asgard being created as well, from the Ymir. And so, you know, maybe it's just like you've got the tree, which is like the foundation, and then the rest is sort of built on top of it, perhaps. I don't know. Or maybe it's just incoherent. I don't know. But it is interesting that, a lot of these pagan myths regarding the creation account deal with something like this, where,
Mhm.
the world is made from a dead god or some primordial being. You see this in like the Babylonian tale, the Enuma Elish, right?
Right,
When,
Tiamat. Yeah.
yeah, right, everything's made out of Tiamat's body, this chaos goddess, which just all kind of interesting conversations that can be had there regarding like, connection to biblical account and that sort of thing. What's different, but also some of the themes that overlap. But this is a very common theme. You see it throughout different cultures. The idea that the world is made out of some kind of slaughter, some kind of brutal contest, which leads to the brutality you very often see in the pagan world, right? The world itself is made out of brutal conflict. And that definitely feeds into the culture, especially the people like the Norse. We talked about in the Havamal that there's that proverb that's just like, if you need to get up early if you want to go kill someone and take their stuff. It's like just part of the process of just daily routine.
It's very different not only from the biblical account but from Tolkien's creation myth, where the universe is brought into being through song. And Lewis as well with the creation of Narnia. So it's very, even though they both loved and respected these myths, they truly they clearly jettisoned stuff that did not harmonize well with their Christian worldview.
Right. I think we said last time they gave us the northern story as it should have been.
Right. Yeah,
It's
exactly.
like you can get off his Saruman as he should have been.
Yeah, it even seemed like in the introduction, like Caroline kind of like chastised Snorri a little bit because, like, I guess Snorri was a Christian guy who was slowly trying to reconcile a little bit, kind of like Beowulf or something else was, and so she was like, well, he was trying to like reconcile this stuff and write it coherently, and he seemed like he let too much of his Christianity weave itself in, and you're like, okay.
I mean, it is interesting that when you read the prose Edda, read the introduction that Snorri gives us, and he says like the gods came from Troy. Like he makes it, he demythologizes some of it as a way of making it a little bit more palatable.
Uh-huh.
He like turns the gods into this race that came from, I mean, the human civilization essentially, rather than these are the gods of Asgard who made everything.
Oh, Joffrey of Monmouth does that too with some of the Arthur stuff. He essentially makes everybody he likes in history like secretly British somehow. It's like Constantine is British, the Trojans are British, like everybody he likes just ends up as a British person.
That's funny. Um, hmm. I guess we need to do our American telling of the mythos. Um,
Oh no.
no, let's not do that. Okay. Any other thoughts about this reading? I mean, obviously there's all kinds of lore stuff, but I'm not qualified to get into some of the weeds on that.
I noticed like a name drop that I recognized from Tolkien. Actually, I noticed several horse names that Tolkien either tweaked a little bit or just put wholesale into Lord of the Rings. In Vafthrudnir sayings, there was a horse called Frostmane, and I immediately thought of Snowmane, Theoden's horse. And then
Nice.
later, I forget which one it is, but there's a horse called Lightfoot, which was Snowmane's sire, like the horse that sired him. So I'm like, okay, he's even taking. I know that he took all the dwarf names from this, but he's also taking a lot of the names of horses and stuff, which makes sense because the Rohirrim are very Norse inspired culture.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, he definitely does lift a number of names and sometimes he makes little tweaks, but Yeah, it's not as startling as the dwarf names that you just listed, um, but yeah, so yeah, definitely that. And there's something else. But he was one of the other ones that'll come to me where he does that.
You know, I thought it's interesting, they talk about how giants basically came from poison drops. Um, and so that's why they're terrifying, and that's why they're evil. But then from a giant, even though it's like from straight poison comes the gods, I guess, that grow underneath the frost giant's arms, right? And so it's like good ends up coming through. I guess good in terms of not as bad kind of stuff, but
Yeah, there's not a clear like good and evil in those stark like moral ontological terms. Now, the
mhm,
gods are definitely good relative to the monsters, but it's more of
right,
like they're fighting for the right side. But there's not like a super clear like eternal standard of goodness.
right.
It's like they're less bad. It's like you want to be on the gods' side because like, they're not going to destroy the universe. So,
It's a good enough reason.
yeah.
Right. I mean, yeah. I mean, they're the valiant ones. They're the ones trying to bring about something like order, and so it's not so much that they are like ontologically good, but they're good in the sense that they're fighting in the right direction. And I mean, what more can you hope for, I guess, in this setting?
I liked what Caroline had said too about how, like in her introduction, about how the giants like had it like you were saying, primordial. They have a past. They were ancient. They know a lot of things, but their future is like in terms of eternity or whatever is short lived. And then while men and the gods are, started later, they have the future. It's kind of like not told completely what's going to happen with them, like long term.
Right. And so I mean, obviously most humans are going to die and most gods are going to die, but it seems like all the giants are going to die. But there is a remnant that's going to live past Ragnarok of both gods and men, right? You've got Leif and Leifthrathir, who I guess are going to be like the new Adam and Eve following Ragnarok to reestablish humanity. And before I started reading the Eddas, I didn't even really recognize that there was a future past Ragnarok. I always had the sense that that was like the apocalypse, which I mean, it is of sorts, but it's also the time of cosmic renewal, uh, maybe even moving into the kind of order that's not possible on this epic of history.
I'm also struck by what a clean slate Tolkien kind of had for his elves, because elves get mentioned a few times, but they're never described in any kind of detail at all. They usually get name dropped between gods and men. And it'll say, gods, elves, and men, and but they're net that we're never told anything about them. So like Tolkien just had like free reign to, create his own version.
Yeah, they are whatever they are in these stories. It's very ambiguous.
Hmm.
Like I said, we're not really given physical descriptions. We're not given any details regarding what they are. I mean, even the context in which they appear, like it's just not really clear what it is that we're talking about. It's sort of just this class of like other things.
Hmm.
Maybe even something like fairies of sorts, which I mean, there is overlapping idea between the fairies and the elves.
Right.
Um,
Yeah. And
eh,
like in the Arthur stuff, elves and fairies are just whatever the particular writer of that story needs them to be for that story.
right. And it's interesting though. I was recently reading Peter Kreeft's The Philosophy of Tolkien, which there goes to my background. Um,
Ah.
it's which it's a wonderful read. I mean, I tweeted a lot of it, so you may have seen some of that. But he makes the point that Tolkien's elves are like the Platonic ideal of elves, where we read them and we just kind of know like, yeah, this is what elves are like.
Yeah, it's very strange.
Right. But yeah, and so he definitely had free reign with that
I've
using the material.
struggled with that as a writer myself. When you try to do elves that aren't like his, like Tolkien's, you get this. At least for me, I get this cognitive dissonance where I'm like, no, that's not right. That's not what they should be like. Because they're not like the ethereal kind of Platonic Tolkienian idea of elves.
Yeah, I feel like if I ever get in the business of writing fantasy, I'm just gonna have to not talk about elves. And I don't know how to get around that to create something
I
that's
Yeah.
believable but not derivative.
I can't get around it because I ended up making them integral to the plot.
Hmm.
So like yeah, but
Yeah, it's a little tricky.
it's just interesting how much of, you know, the Norse material was a fountainhead for Tolkien and Lewis and their contemporaries, but then Tolkien and Lewis have become this fountainhead for everything after, you know.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it, it's crazy that they're still relatively modern authors,
Hmm.
and then just the influence that they've had, to the point of, I mean, they set the stage. I mean, especially regarding like fantasy. I mean, you can't do that without having Tolkien somewhere in your mind. I mean, he basically created the modern genre of the fantasy novel.
Right, and I think because it's modern, that's why it was in the age of communication. You know, radio had been a thing for decades by the time Lord of the Rings was out. You know, once you have mass communication and the mass distribution of literature, it's going to become like the a meme essentially. It's going to sweep across cultures and across continents and just become, you know, stuck in our imagination.
Well, and also, I mean, it's interesting. I was reading the introduction to this, and it was talking about how, all the Norse thought and stories and poems and stuff, I guess in Germany, or kind of like mainland Europe, were out of fashion, less talked about post World War II because of like the ties to, Germany and Nazism and stuff. But then immediately after, Tolkien and Lewis kind of rectify them and shape them so that then they're, I mean, look of what they've done for even American like telling of different Norse stuff, whether it's like Thor and Marvel or something, or any of like the later books, like you're saying, it really kind of like, nope, you're not actually going to take that fully from it just because you associated with it, right? We're going to take it back, which is cool.
Yeah, I haven't read it. I've heard tell of some kind of some book that focuses specifically on Tolkien wrestling with the myth as it's been adopted from, with the Nazis, and I mean obviously he had wrote some letters about that, about that ruddy ignoramus Adolf Hitler, and he said that at his age, as like a older middle-aged guy, he says he'd be a better fighter than when he was in his prime, because he just really had such hostility toward what Hitler was doing. And Lewis said the same thing, that he was furious with what the Nazis were doing to his beloved Northern mythos, until he recognized they were getting it all wrong. And then they kind of gave it back to them, because, and the whole Northern mythos is the idea that the heroes fighting alongside the gods have their back against the wall, and that, at least up through Ragnarok, like the monsters are going to end up winning, in this grand sense.
Hmm.
And so the heroes of the Northern mythos are not the ones going out conquering everything. They're the ones with their back against the wall, fighting for as long as they possibly can. And so at the same time that the Nazis are trying to appropriate the Northern mythos to portray themselves as these Northern heroes, they're actually playing the role of the monsters.
The monsters, yeah. I think it became more entrenched in Nazi ideology towards the end. Like, I mean, where they started calling, like the complete collapse of Germany and it being overrun from all sides. They would use phrases like God or Damaron, the twilight of the gods, Ragnarok. And so like I think it became, yeah, so sort of like they identified it with it a lot towards the end, but it was, they were trying to in some cases just replace Christianity with either like neo-pagan ideas, especially Heinrich Himmler and the SS. Like there's this great book called The Master Plan, and I'm forgetting the author right now, but it chronicles the SS's kind of like appropriation of not just Norse mythology, but archaeology and history in general, trying to rewrite the whole thing along, Nazi lines. And their crazy sort of bizarre, like creation of liturgies and rituals to de-Christianize Germany and replace it with this new hodgepodge of Norse, old Germanic stuff and just stuff that they invented. And it's deeply unsettling. I'll say
Yeah,
that.
yeah. Of course, the Nazis were interested in all kinds of cultic things and trying to reclaim religious artifacts and
Yeah, like
yeah,
that's a real thing. People think that's just Indiana Jones, but no, that was actual, loosely, incredibly loosely, but based on real history. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I mean, there are stories about, Hitler trying to find the, lance that pierced Christ or the, contact aliens, like all sorts of
No,
stuff.
yeah,
Um,
Himmler thought, well, yeah, in the master plan they talk about how Himmler wanted to find Thor's hammer. He thought Thor's hammer was an
right.
actual device that ancient people had used, some sort of electric weapon or something. And he's like, "We'll win the war" and all that stuff. So,
Which it's unsettling and insane, but I mean, it's interesting.
and it's made for good stories ever since. If one good thing came out of it, it's you know.
You're telling me Jane from Thor was really just a descendant of Hitler looking, found that hammer that was finally there, But oh man,
Yeah. It's a good thing they lost
yeah.
for many reasons. Um,
But
anything
we're
else
dealing with that
from, yeah, go
today,
ahead.
right? Just I was just going to say, like, that danger of the appropriation of culture to be used for like state propaganda the Nazis didn't invent it, and it certainly didn't die with them.
Oh, for sure. And I mean, it's probably, I mean, it's maybe particularly a problem that can be presented within democracy, where, so much of politics really just comes down to marketing, right? That,
Mm,
especially in, a day and age where most of the electorate doesn't really know what's going on, right? And so, you watch the presidential debates over the last several years, and they're not really asking questions like, what is the good of man and what is the role of the government in facilitating, our
no.
actualization of the human potential. No, it's all just like kind of clickbaity type stuff. Like, how can I get my little clip in there to, throw onto TikTok or Twitter or whatever. It's nothing dealing with substance. It all comes down to just marketing, right? And that's where, it can become very easy to appropriate these various marketing elements that are going to give rise to certain sentiments. And so it's very easy, whether we're talking about, the autocratic style or even just the marketing style of a democracy. It's very easy to appropriate culture to move it in that sort of direction.
Yeah, I mean, uneducated democracy too, right? Like with marketing it, if you don't, like Thomas was saying, if you're not understanding and knowing some of the background, you can't even tell that they misaligned it or like reconfigured whatever it was, whatever the message was, whatever the myth was for their own purposes. If you don't know the myth, you're just like, okay, well, I need to throw it
Right.
out, right? So because it's
Right.
even related. So
Yeah. And I mean, it's even setting aside the political angle, and not to mention some of the propaganda Marvel's pushing through these days.
Uh,
But maybe I'll just leave
that's the
that
thing.
there.
Even our modern myths become essentially, consumed by the marketing aspect. That's something that the writers of this material did not have to deal with. The fact that, they're writing myths, but they didn't have to sell them to anybody. So,
Right. And there's this idea that the myth is valuable for its own sake,
mhm.
right? I mean, and that's why, this book is recorded. It's why, Snorri put together the prose edda. It's this idea that there are things that are worth preserving. It's not so much what can I do to launch things forward with this, but it's
Mhm.
more of how do we conserve the wisdom that we already have. And this is a very different mindset versus how can I market this? How can I publish this? What media can I spin out of this?
How can
Right?
I sell action figures?
Exactly. And that gets to the difference between, and this is even like explicitly, political, but just general philosophical, the difference between conservatism and progressivism, that one is set on preserving the wisdom that we have, the other is set on what can I do with this? Well, anything else anyone wants to mention about Vafthrudnir sayings? If not, then we can jump to the next one. The Mythic Mind Fellowship presents a new study led by Dr. Andrew Snyder, The Wisdom of Middle-earth, the Lord of the Rings. This will be the first study in the Wisdom of Middle-earth series, which seeks to bring an array of companions together with a common desire of growing in wisdom while enjoying the heartening tales of the great tale weaver, J.R.R. Tolkien. The Lord of the Rings is a profound tale that has literally changed lives, as it has for mine. And what is it that makes this story so powerful and so compelling? It is because Tolkien's stories are fundamentally true, and those who engage with it know exactly what I mean. They speak to the way that things are. As Peter Kreeft said in The Philosophy of Tolkien, the Lord of the Rings is infused with the same light that illumined the man who wrote it, and that light is true, for it reveals the reality of the world and life. So join us on this adventure. Let us grow in wisdom together through immersion in this tale, not through cheap allegorizing, but by getting a better understanding of the ideas and the movements of the heart that bring a tale such as this to life. This 12-week study will begin with Tolkien's creation account, the Ainulindale, and then move to the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring. Each week will include assigned reading from the Lord of the Rings, a short side lesson at the beginning of the week that addresses a relevant theme, background story, or secondary text. And then, once you've had some time to do the reading, there will be a longer video that serves as a guide in these forests of wisdom. Also, we will have additional recommended readings, an active Discord channel, and weekly live meetings, which will be recorded in case you cannot attend. Whether you are reading The Lord of the Rings for the first time, or the 11st time, I invite you to join our company. Prices are currently as low as they ever have been, and they are as low as they ever will be, so go ahead and join today at andrewsnyder.podia.com. And I hope to see you on this road that goes ever on. Well then, jumping over to Grimnir sayings, or Grimnismal, I'm going to read just a little bit of the first portion of the introduction here. The prose introduction to Grimnismal gives an unexpected account of Odin and Frigga as rival patrons to two kingly candidates, the lost son of King Hrodund. Oh, it's period there. Hrodund. Odin uses cunning to give his foster son an unfair advantage, and then precipitates a matrimonial quarrel by pointing out the different fates which have overtaken their proteges. Frigga is swift to get her own back, accusing Odin's favorite of stinginess, a serious charge given the near-sacred character which Germanic societies ascribe to hospitality. Frigga duplicitously ensures that Geirröd does mistreat his guest, relying on Odin's practice of disguising himself when visiting strange halls. Odin arrives at Geirröd's hall, calling himself Grimnir, the masked one. Geirröd's methods of torture, starvation, and heat have been thought to recall shamanistic rituals, allowing access to arcane knowledge kept hidden from the uninitiated. Such practice could have been known to the Scandinavians from their northern neighbors, the Lapps. Okay, and then it goes on, and then at the end, Odin reveals himself. And so, yeah, so there are these two lost sons of this king, and so Odin and Frigga, they both kind of adopt one to, raise them up to take over the throne with the death of their father. But things don't go very well for Odin.
And they have two different fates. Like you said, I just thought something just popped into my mind. That reminds me of the twins from The Horse and His Boy, right? One becomes a prince and the other is like a slave. So that's a common trope, right? Where brothers or twins have these extremely divergent outcomes.
Yeah, and it's a good indication of how, your own life very well could have gone a different direction, but that we all are subject to fate, which obviously fate plays a very significant role in these northern stories. And so it's this idea that they're different paths that we could find ourselves put on. Right. What are some thoughts that you had?
Again, I like that he's called the masked one. Because like we were saying before about, like Merlin and Gandalf and just this idea of illusion, the wizard being and even the term wizard, wise one, being a creature of illusion. And they say he has a blue cloak, which immediately reminded me, of one of Tolkien, the blue wizards, so
Right. Yeah, and we get that same idea that we were talking about how Odin is he's almost always veiled. So later on in this story, he recounts all these different names that he's had. It's like a million different pseudonyms that he's adopted here and there.
yeah.
Again, showing the fact that he's almost always veiled in his dealings with mortals.
Gandalf does that once where he tells Faramir all the various
Oh,
names
right.
that he's had in different lands. Yeah.
Seems like Odin and Frigg have got to a lull in the relationship where they just need to kind of, pick some people, just make some make a fight happen,
Right.
it works.
Oh, and at
Yeah.
one point I wrote this down. Odin calls himself Wanderer. So like Mithrandir, the Gray Pilgrim, the Gray Wanderer. So more Gandalf
Yes.
associations.
Yes. It's all in Tolkien. Bless me. Yeah, I kind of thought, especially by the time we get to the end of this story, I thought of Hebrews about, you know, entertaining strangers because, you might be entertaining angels unaware.
Oh yeah.
Especially the role of hospitality plays as the king's son, um, also named Gerold, right? Yeah, he's the one who shows hospitality to Odin, not recognizing who he is, and he gets rewarded for that. And so, I think that's a potential connection there.
And then what is it? The king gets impaled on his own sword, which was an act because at first I was like, oh, like Turin, except Turin was suicide, and this it was
Right.
just a silly accident, almost a slapstick kind of accident.
Yeah, and I assume that that's the fate that wrought somebody who was consumed with pride, that he would
Hmm.
stumble and fall um very unheroically onto his own sword, in this kind of slapstick way. And he's showing that he was kind of a buffoon because he was so consumed by pride. Like, this is how he treats his guests. Um
Trying to roast him alive. Yeah, it's
Right. It reminds me of that Chesterton quote about how, thinking in isolation and in pride makes you into an idiot. I think that we see something like that playing out here.
Now, who are the powers again? I was trying to
What's the
look when
what's
it
the
says
context?
like was this line six where it says there is a third home where the cheerful powers roofed the rooms with silver. Is the powers just like pre-god gods kind of thing, or
I think the powers are essentially just the gods, is my
okay,
understanding. Um, and in the Silmarillion in particular, sometimes Tolkien will refer to the powers, by which he means the Valar.
yeah, that's right.
gotcha, okay. And that makes sense because line four is until the powers are torn asunder. Okay.
Yeah, right.
I noticed a couple of name drops too that are actually not related to Tolkien, but are related to Star Wars. Um, uh, they mention Skull and Hati, who are the two wolves who devour the sun and moon or constantly chase them around. And in some of the more contemporary Star Wars, there's two characters who are named after those figures. There are a couple of, well, they don't think of themselves as Jedi, but they're kind of like rogue Jedi called Balin Skull and Shin Hati. And they basically confirm that, yeah, their names Skull and Hati are taken from the Norse myth of these wolves that chase the sun and moon. So I thought that was interesting.
I'm curious. I'm not up to date on like the new Star Wars media, but I mean, is there any connection between their characters and their mythological counterparts? And the naming?
Well, we haven't seen the end of their character arc yet, so I'm not sure.
Okay, fair
I
enough.
didn't. There was nothing that jumped out at me immediately. But I know that the kind of Lucasfilm's kind of creative head honcho Dave Filoni is a big fan of the Norse stuff. So I'm just not surprised that he would litter some of the new material with Norse references.
Yeah, it is kind of interesting. Just as he goes through the different realms of Asgard, the different homes of the gods, you get some insights into kind of the different, um, I mean, different aesthetic associated with some of the different gods. Um, I look to Baldur because he's one of the gods I'm more familiar with because he plays such an important role in the story, as well as I think his potential connection to Christ regarding the fact that he's the God who dies and he resurrects, and in his resurrection he kind of brings us into the new world order post Ragnarok, and so
Mm.
I think there is some Christological topology there in my reckoning. As Lewis says, that the pagan myths are you've got celestial strength falling on a jungle of filth and imbecility. That there is glory and truth to be found here, even if that needs to be extracted. But we're told that Baldur he dwells in his hall um, has the fewest runes of ill omen to show that he's associated with sort of peace and tranquility and prosperity and goodness. But it kind of makes sense that in the brutal scene that we get in the northern story, that he's one of the gods that dies.
Yeah, there's more about Ymir again in the creation of the world. Um, so the dwelling place of men, Midgard, is made from the eyelashes of Ymir. That's rather humorous. And his brains are the clouds. Oh, okay. Great.
Yeah, you wonder like why was it taken like eyelashes any significance there, but I don't know.
Yeah. Which
I have no
and
idea.
this reminds me of another fantasy author who was heavily inspired by this material was Gene Wolfe, because I'm currently reading his Wizard Knight duology. And in that, there's the many worlds. But I don't think there's nine. I think there's seven in that. And the sort of world above the one where humans live is populated by this race of gods that are very much like the Aesir. I even think the main one is even called Allfather, like Odin, Allfather. And there's that thing about the clouds reminded me of, like, because there's a lot of cloud imagery in his ideas about how, like, that literally the realm of his sort of Aesir gods is called sky, but it's spelled different. It's spelled Skai, and like you can see like the clouds are how like the gods communicate messages down to humanity.
They send thoughts through the brain.
Yeah. Yeah, almost. Yeah.
Interesting. Um, And then we see a little bit more about Yggdrasil as well. We're told that it's like filled with different creatures, especially different serpents. And that Nidhogg, the
Oh,
dragons
Nithog.
essentially in
Yeah.
hell, is chewing on its roots, and we're told that its side is decaying, and so it's like the world itself is it's groaning for renewal, right? It's kind of falling apart. That the very structure of the cosmos is in a state of suffering and decay.
Just the name of that creature and its whole, like, that whole aspect of, like, of what its function is just screamed Lovecraft to me for some reason.
Well, yeah, I
I
mean,
just
you've
remember it
got
from
this. Good.
God. I just remember it from Age of Mythology where I just use it against my enemies and it was the best. Go ahead.
Yep, that's one of the important foundations for understanding the ancient mythos.
Yeah. I like seeing the like inescapable fate. Like I know I saw that a lot in the Volsung Saga, where it was basically like you know Brynhild like basically says what's going to happen. You know, but the story still has to play out to get to that, and they can't really go around it. Like here at the end, where he's you know Odin says, "I know your life is over," and the guy just not realizing like doesn't know the sword's going to land hilt down at that time.
Yeah, yeah, and that's something that we do see very often in these myths, this emphasis on fate, the fact that we're told ahead of time what's going to happen. It's like when you're reading Beowulf, when basically as soon as he encounters the dragon, we're told the dragon's going to kill him. And it gets to a point where even he knows he's about to die before even engaging with the dragon. And so, the story is not about what's going to happen, really. The story is about how do you relate to fate. Um, and so it's a different kind of hero's journey than, go forth and save the world. No, it's more of um, engage with honor as you engage with the fate that is going to take place.
Right. It's less of like what you said, Andrew, that progressive kind of how can I change the world? And it's more, how can I accept the fate that I've been given, essentially, and with honor and integrity.
Yeah, it wouldn't be a bad thing to, read something like Marcus Aurelius's Meditations alongside the Poetic Edda, or some of this Norse literature, because there definitely
Hmm.
is a stoic tone to the kind of heroism that's prescribed to us. Well, is there anything else that anyone wants to mention about Grimnir sayings? We spent a while on the first one, so I'm okay if you want to move on if there's nothing else. All right. All right. Moving over to Skirnir's journey.
Hmm.
Freyr falls in love with a giant's daughter, whom he sees from Odin's high seat, Hildskjalf. According to Snorri, his lovesickness is a punishment for usurping Odin's place, though the poem does not suggest this. Freyr's concerned parents, Njord and Skadi, ask their son's old friend and servant, Skirnir, to help. Skirnir volunteers to go on a wooing mission and, after a remarkably smooth journey, effectively bullies the reluctant girl into agreeing to a rendezvous with Freyr. All right, well, we'll stop there. Yeah, so it's not exactly a romance per se. um, I don't know. What do you guys think about this one?
I like that they said that it could have been originally composed to be played out like
Hmm.
a dramatic presentation. I
Yeah,
definitely got that vibe from it.
it is interesting. And so she brings up that in Snorri's telling of this, we get this idea that Freyr is setting himself up for a kind of punishment because of his pride in taking up the spot of Odin, essentially, trying to usurp a role that doesn't belong to him naturally. And she says that in the original poem, we don't really see that kind of judgment at play here. But one thing that it is interesting is that Skirnir um, asks for Freyr's sword, which means that Freyr's going to lose his weapon, so he's not going to have a sword when it comes time for Ragnarok. And so he is surrendering something of value here. We kind of get the sense, I think, that he is being short-sighted in some way, shape, or form in what he's doing here. And there were some of the proverbs in the Havamal that warn against the foolishness that can come through your desire for women.
Right, yeah. We see that sort of brought to life in this little story.
Right. And then, of course, we also see the idea of the curse that words can be binding. As Gerd, this giantess, initially refuses, despite the fact that Skirnir has promised her all these things, including Odin's ring, which he got from the dwarves, his ring that produces more gold rings, and so he basically promised or offers her this great wealth, which I mean, I don't really know if this was Skirnir's even offer. He's offering Odin's ring, which again gets this idea that maybe he's trying to usurp some authority that doesn't belong to him. But nonetheless, that doesn't work. And so then he just starts threatening her, and he goes through this barrage of curses that are going to befall her if she doesn't come with him. And so it's this idea that there's power simply in these verbal declarations, which I mean, you see the importance of oaths and curses in Tolkien as well.
Oh yeah, definitely. Like with the oath breakers or Feanor's dreadful oath, and where
Hmm.
they're just compelled to see it through to the end, no matter what.
Right.
Yeah, it just becomes like a litany of like threats and insults. Like it just devolves towards the end and then, uh her and Freyr get together. I'm like, okay,
Right.
great.
She kind of reluctantly agrees because, well, I mean, that sounds better than all these curses. So,
Uh,
um, all right, fair enough.
and then like, oh, the symbolism of nine keeps cropping up in
Hmm.
these. And what is it? Like Freyr has to wait 9 days before
Oh,
he can
right,
have a tryst with her or something like that.
right.
I had a contractor that I worked with one time. It was the first time we had ever worked, and he wanted to tell me about the magic number nine. I went into like an hour long
Oh
diatribe,
no.
sent me videos about it, and I was just like, okay,
Uh,
so maybe there's something there with nine.
Yeah, maybe. But yeah, I don't really have a whole lot to say about this one.
no,
It
yeah.
wasn't really a very fun read for me.
No, yeah.
Uh, so if there's nothing else, I'm fine just jumping to the next one.
The next one was funnier, I
It
think.
was
Yeah.
funny.
The setup and just like one since the reader is in the know. Well, I'll let you explain it. What's going on here.
Yeah,
So,
and I won't even necessarily read it, but basically, Thor comes upon Odin in disguise, and Odin is disguised as a ferryman, and so Thor wants Odin to give him passage across this body of water, but instead they end up just getting into an insult match, which is just so
yeah.
brutal and sometimes vulgar and profane.
Yeah.
It's like a couple of just like frat guys just going at each other.
Yeah, it was great.
I mean, so it starts off with Thor for no good reason, just insulting this ferryman, by saying, "Who's that lad of lads who stands on that side of the inlet?" And we get this idea, and I think there's even a note in this translation here somewhere that says that basically Thor was making fun of the fact that this guy looked old, and so he's calling him a child as a way of
Uh-oh.
like being sarcastic with him, and so that's what kicks us off. I love that one of the first things
Uh.
that this guy's Odin says in response is, "You you, you look like someone whose mother's dead."
What does that even mean? Yeah, that was great. There's some other funny stuff in here. What was yeah, he says like Thor has no guts. He says at one point, just like it becomes like schoolyard insults. Like Thor calls Harbard is Odin's disguise. He calls
Uh-huh.
him a pervert several times for seemingly no reason. Um,
Well, because so it starts off with early on, Odin says that it looks like your mom is dead, and then later on, he says like you should probably go home because someone's sleeping with your wife.
oh yeah.
And
Oh,
that's one of the times where he calls him a pervert. He says, "Yeah, someone was Sif right now. You better go home."
I thought this was interesting because at one point Odin says Odin owns the nobles who fall in battle, and Thor
Hmm.
owns the race of thralls. And in the explanatory note at the beginning, they say maybe that's the author like making commentary on the cults of the two gods, where Thor was more of the everyman's god, basically, of like farmers and herdsmen and ordinary people, whereas Odin was for like the knightly class and the noble warriors and stuff like that, nobility.
Right, and so it's a way of putting Thor in his place as being under him.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's interesting that they go back and forth bragging about the different conquests of sorts that they've all engaged with, which very much makes you think of, and in the intro it brings this up even, the exchange in Beowulf between Beowulf and Unferth, where Beowulf shows up at Herot, and Unferth says, "Well, aren't you the Beowulf who lost that swimming competition?" And
Oh
then
yeah.
and then Beowulf says, that's the mead talking. And, he goes off on all these, this explanation of what happened, how he did kind of lose the swimming competition because he went off to kill all these sea monsters, and then he ends that by calling Unforth a kinslayer. Um, so it's like similar kind of just like brutal back and forth exchange.
I love that. It was like, I lost a swimming contest, but it was only so I could go kill a bunch of sea monsters. It's like humble bragging, you know?
Right. Unlike you, who killed your own kin.
Yeah. Odin talks about burial mounds at one point, which they use a euphemism, which they explain in the notes.
Right.
The men who have their home in the woods means like
Right.
cairns and burial mounds and stuff.
It's interesting that basically all of Thor's conquests that he brags about are like literal conquests, like combat, fighting. And so he's, defeated all these different people and these she-wolves, like all these different things. But then basically all of Odin's bragging is about his conquest of women and how he's like seduced all these women. Like that's his way of bragging, which I mean I guess gets to his like wisdom used in the loose sense of the fact that like he's able to use his knowledge to be manipulative and like that's seen as some kind of strength. Obviously not in accordance with what we would call virtue, but it just goes to their different strengths that he has his mind, Thor has his hammer.
Right. It's like Odin, I guess, is what we would today would say he's crafty.
Right, he's crafty.
I was trying to find it in the Sega of the Volsungs, but they also a portion had the like insult contest, basically going back and forth. And I was like, it just must have been common of like men saying like, "Oh, you're this," and no, you're actually this.
Right, this mix of bragging and insults.
Especially if it's from like ship to like land or ship to across. It's like over a large distance.
Right, just like
right.
yelling these things to each other.
So the other guy can't just like punch you in the head or stab you or something.
And we need to get Odin and Thor on Twitter.
It would be better than 90% of the stuff that's there now. I like that eventually he just gives Thor directions. He refuses him passage. And Thor's like, well, fine. Can you give me directions then? And he just does. And then it ends.
And at one point, Odin says, I'll compensate you with an arm ring. And I don't know if you read the notes on that.
No.
Because he whatever this is, it brings some great offense to Thor. Because Thor responds to that by saying, "Where did you find such despicable words? I've never heard words more despicable." And Larrington suggests that okay, maybe this is because an arm ring is like it's not that significant, so it seems like it's a way of like dishonoring him with like junk. But also, she thinks that this might be some kind of euphemism for like some kind of sexual activity.
Oh.
And so that's why he responds like, "You just said something like really vulgar here. I've never heard something so despicable." Which that seems to make more sense given his response.
That's the thing when you read this older material and even scripture. Sometimes we're missing a lot of cultural context.
Right.
Like people will read older books or mythology or the books of the Bible and say, "Well, that's weird." And it's like, "Well, yeah, but we're we didn't grow up in these centuries. We're missing a lot of context here."
Yeah, we're gonna be weird at some point for way down the line.
Yeah,
that's true. But yeah, I mean, I really don't have anything of like penetrating wisdom to bring to this. I just think it's a funny exchange.
I feel like this was more like entertainment, like this particular passage, and it was meant to like be anything profound or something like that.
I just love how brutal it is.
Yeah.
And again, the fact that it just kicks off with looks like your mom died.
I wonder if Thor's mom was actually dead by this point, because I think she was a giantess or something like that.
I'm not sure.
But it's and they they've brought this up in other adaptations of this material, like in the recent God of War games, about just how poorly Odin treats Thor. He's his son, and yet he treats him. He's clearly not the favorite son, and is treated like just like scum on his boot. Like
Right, for like no
Wait,
good reason.
Odin's actually smart because he gets into an insult match with someone that he knows, but he's disguised himself.
he's disguised. Yeah.
So it's like he's got the inside track on everything that's happened with the guy.
Hmm.
Right? Thor's just like, what's wrong with this reign of ferrymen?
Why are you being so mean?
I was just like, the whole time I was thinking, he wants to get across this bay or whatever it is. And I'm like, you're a god. Can't you fly? Or like, do some other thing that will transport you across this area? Why do you need this ferryman? Maybe I'm thinking too much about it.
Yeah, it's like sometimes they seem very limited, and other times they don't, which I assume just gets to some of the different traditions and stories thrown together. That sometimes they seem more like mortals than other times.
They definitely certainly act like mortals most of the
Yes.
time. They're petty, jealous, vulgar.
Not a great conclusion here.
On that note, yeah.
I mean, is there anything else that anyone wants to bring up? It's okay if not, but I don't want to cut you off if there is. All right, fair enough. Well, I think that's at least a fun way to end. I feel like it's a good conversation. I mean, despite the fact that we're all amateurs here, and obviously there's a lot that we're not picking up. I feel like there's a good bit that we are picking up, and I feel like it's producing some good conversation. And so I've enjoyed this, and I look forward to seeing where it goes next time.
Yeah, these are fun. I've enjoyed reading
Yeah,
these because I've never really, my only experience with the Norse myths has mostly been through adaptations
right.
or summaries, like secondary material. It's neat to go back to the original source and finally learn about this stuff.
Yeah, it's definitely fun to dig into some things that we've only kind of experienced on the periphery. Also, it's just fun, as somebody who, I make my living talking about things that I at least claim to know. It's fun, engaging with something like this where, none of us really know what's going on, but just fun to explore it and to talk about it together. All right. Well, I guess we'll go ahead and wrap it there. And so thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.